And the oldest university in the English-speaking world has that as its motto. The University of Oxford, which has produced 26 British prime ministers, 30 international heads of states, 12 saints, and 47 Nobel Prize winners up to date. Who has already mesmerized Calcutta a year ago with his debating skills. He loves journalism, he loves history, and he hates the Everton Football Club. Matt.
Thousands of years ago, when cavemen first came out of their caves and started communicating with one another, they spoke in barely articulate and barely comprehensible grunts. In 2012, people on Facebook and Twitter talk in a language of jargon, of acronyms, and hashtags. Thousands of years ago, cavemen communicated with crudely drawn paintings on the cave walls. Nowadays, people exchange emoticons and smiley faces which look nothing like any human that I've ever seen. Cavemen ended their conversations, if they could be called that, by probably battering each other with clubs, then turning away confused. Nowadays, unable to express anything resembling an argument or an idea in 140 characters or less on Twitter, most conversations end in a digital form of that club deathmatch. When I look at the state of communication on social media in 2012, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we've got that far at all. So in terms of my speech today, I'm going to ask you, first of all, what communication actually is. Secondly, whether or not social networking constitutes this communication. And thirdly, even if it does it direct communication in a positive way or in a negative way? Because I think that's important when we're considering whether or not social networking is a failure. So in terms of what communication actually is, it's not just an exchange of information. It's also the capacity for that information to be digested and understood by the recipient. I don't think communication is just conversations. It's not just having thousands of Facebook friends. And it's not the capacity to tell the world or anyone who'll listen what you had for breakfast. By the way, I had beans on toast and it was delicious. I think communication is a bit more than that. First of all, I think it's an expression of your true self and not an artificial image. Secondly, I think it's an exchange of ideas and ideals. Thirdly, I think it's the idea that you've got the clarity to convey those sorts of ideas and them to be well received by a recipient. So why don't we get this when we've got social media? First of all, in terms of expressing your true self. And I think there are a couple of reasons why we can't have this in social media. First of all, because people are simply too complicated to be expressed in 140 characters or less, okay? When you sign up to a Facebook profile, you're asked to put an about me, when you're asked to boil down your character, boil down everything about you into 50 words or less. I think even the most uninteresting person on the planet would struggle to do that. And referring to some of the examples that the other speakers have brought up, I think that social media actually suggests that issues are a lot more simple than they actually are. So we had the example of the Haitian earthquake, okay? The idea that just by liking a post and showing your friends what a philanthropic guy you are and throwing a bit of money at the problem isn't the solution, okay? Earthquakes and relief efforts are much more complicated than that and require, a proper explanation of that, which you don't get online because you've simply not got the space to do it and no one's going to bother to read it. So even in that area, social media obfuscates the ability to have a proper communication about these issues. The next reason that I don't think we get true expression is because what you put on Facebook is falsely crafted, okay? When you're deciding what your profile picture is going to be, no one's looking for the most accurate, no one chooses the most accurate reflection of what they actually look like. They sift through all of their photos and look on the one where, they look closest to like what they'd like to look like. Some people toy with them on Photoshop. They pick, this is probably going to be my next profile picture, so all my friends think I'm a really big deal. This isn't me in my normal life, okay? It's not an accurate reflection. Also in terms of communication, okay, communication is meant to be spontaneous. It's meant to be people saying what they really think. When you're having a conversation with someone on Facebook and they ask you a difficult question, you can type out your answer, consider it for a bit, and then delete it if you don't think it's going to be what they want to hear. That emphatically isn't communication. That's lies. That's bordering on lies and bordering on deceit, ladies and gentlemen. The next reason for which I don't think that you can have this sort of communication is because it's very difficult to have a positive exchange of ideas on any social media website. First of all, because the sheer level of complete inanity which is out there, okay? If you're on Twitter and you follow any sort of celebrities or politicians or sports stars, you've got to really sift through in order to find anything bordering on the worthwhile. Instead, what you're hearing is what they had for breakfast, what their kids had for breakfast, why they really like taking them to school that day, what they're watching on television. There's so much out there that the search for something which is worthwhile, the search for worthwhile information, is made incredibly difficult by the fact that in order to get to that, you've got to wade through so much rubbish. The next thing that I think is difficult is the level of clarity, okay? When someone's expressing their ideas, not in, a well thought out and structured argument, but with atrocious grammar, not seeming to be able to tell the difference there and they are, and not being able to actually express it because they're limited by characters and limited by the capacity to get those ideas across in a way that people are going to listen to. You're not going to get the exchange of ideas that is needed in order to say that this is actually communication, okay? So if we consider even if, for social media to constitute a failure of communication, it has to actually not be communication, then the proposition side still wins this debate. Now let's think about, though, if we're talking about communication being, a failure of communication being whether or not it's being directed in a positive way. Because I think this is also really important. If I've got a problem with someone, I can't go, or I wouldn't go, and knock on Alistair Cook's door and scream abuse at him, criticising his batting, his fielding, and his haircut. A couple of reasons for that. First of all, don't really have a reason to at the moment because we're doing pretty well against you guys, and also, he has beautiful hair. But secondly, and more important, is because it's very difficult when you've got to put your ideas across. It's important that you've got the filter of having to actually look someone in the face and be able to justify yourself to them. It's incredibly easy to sit behind a keyboard, to adopt an anonymous persona and vent vitriol at people that you don't like. First of all, because it's anonymous, so there's less of a threat of repercussions and you probably won't get found out. Secondly, because even if you do admit who you are, the fact that you don't have to look them in person, the fact that you don't have to consider their emotional reaction, makes it incredibly easy for people, and it happens all the time, to just put out things not thinking about it into the real world, with horrible consequences, both for the recipient, who, does suffer from those words, and they're very real to that person, but also to people who unthinkingly, put things on Twitter they probably shouldn't have, and then can potentially wind up in prison. So for both of those people, it's an incredibly bad thing that the instantaneous nature of social networking websites. This is the extreme end of this argument, okay? This is what social media can become at its very worst, okay? Cyberbullying and harassment, which really ruins people's lives in a very, very real way. Even at its best level, okay, even if it's just me sitting for hours at my screen with the window open, continually refreshing, hoping for a notification or a friend request to appear, that still constitutes a waste of time. That still constitutes me putting a false image of myself out into the real world, and that can't be said to A, be true communication, and B, to be a positive form of communication, and so is a failure of communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have a question for Matt? If we have a questioner who hasn't asked before, perhaps. Is there anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question? Yes, would you like to come quickly to the closest microphone?
Your premise is based on if you don't like that type of communication, then it is a failure. The opposition's premise is that as long as there is some form of, whether you like it or not, if I've got through to you, that's communicating. So I think that you are debating two separate ideas completely. Would you comment on that?
Okay, so I don't think it's about whether or not you like that communication. I think it's whether or not, first of all, that can be said to be communication. So if someone just screams abuse at me over Twitter, that's not communication, and that's not information that's being exchanged. That's someone unthinkingly typing a few characters in, and then it's not getting through to the other person in a rational way. So communication is based on the idea that both sides are entering into it willingly and are able to digest one another's opinions and be able to then form new opinions around it. At its worst level, that sort of communication and social networking can be the sort of cyberbullying that I spoke about in my main speech. Even at its best, it can just be a level of confusion and a level of difficulty to understand because of the necessary limitations placed upon social networking, i.e. in terms of character length, in terms of how much you can actually write, and in terms of how much people are willing to listen. That even if you are putting it together in a very sensible way, and even if the message does technically send to the other person, it might not necessarily be received by them. I think that's an important distinction to make. So thank you for the question.